So Donald Trump argued that the COVID-19 pandemic came out of nowhere and was something that nobody could have seen coming. How have those statements since been assessed?
Not particularly well, Joe. He was talking at the time about the failure of the testing regime. This was the CDC testing regime. Early on, really failed to detect an enormous number of cases throughout, particularly the month of February, early on in the pandemic. It's estimated that 28,000 cases were missed in that month. The CDC thought there were only 16 people with the virus in America, but there were in fact tens of thousands. Donald Trump said that, it's not his fault, nobody could have seen it coming, but people have basically been since then looking into what preparedness America had for a pandemic. There was a lot of work done under the Obama administration after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. They wrote a pandemic playbook for what to do in the case of a pandemic, and which was then handed over to the Trump administration. But additionally, the other thing that was done was George W. Bush, back well more than a decade ago, did put in billions of dollars worth of work planning for what to do if a pandemic hit the United States. And in fact, it's a strange coincidence, Joe, that today is exactly 15 years to the day since George W. Bush gave a speech at the National Institute of Health outlining the plans that he wanted to make in case of a pandemic coming to the United States. This is what he said.
A pandemic is a lot like a forest fire. If caught early, it might be extinguished with limited damage. If allowed to smolder, undetected, it can grow to an inferno that spreads quickly beyond our ability to control it. In a pandemic, everything from syringes to hospital beds, respirators, masks, and protective equipment would be in short supply. So the federal government is stockpiling critical supplies in locations across America as part of the strategic national stockpile. To respond to a pandemic, the American people need to have information to protect themselves and others. In a pandemic, an infection carried by one person can be transmitted to many other people, and so every American must take personal responsibility for stopping the spread of the virus.
So, Matt, if those preparations were put in place, why did the US response end up being so poorly managed?
Well, from what I can tell from my research for the podcast, America, if you're listening, the big issue was the lack of communication from previous administrations to this one. There was very little handover work done at the end of the Obama administration. Additionally, the people who did receive that handover, those handover briefings, at the beginning of the Trump administration, many of them were fired during the early years of the Trump administration. And by the time the pandemic arrived, many of the people who were in charge of the agencies of the US government that were meant to swing into action in the case of a pandemic were brand new to the job, had no experience in running a large government agency, and hadn't been briefed on exactly what needed to be done. And so immediately all these planks of the plan fell over. They were unable to test people. They were unable to supply masks out of the strategic national stockpile, which had been filled, depleted and not refilled. And then at the end of what George W. Bush said there, he said that Americans need information. Americans need information about how to protect themselves and others in the case of a pandemic. And that was the biggest breakdown, sort of as the pandemic worsened. The ability, the federal government and Donald Trump at the top of it really was not providing good information for what Americans should be doing in order to try and get control of a pandemic, despite the fact that enormous amounts of preparation had been done for what to do in this exact scenario over the past 2 decades. And the guy at the head of that was Anthony Fauci, of course, who has become a very famous face in America. And he really found, when the pandemic arrived, that the structures that had been built while he'd been there just failed very quickly and weren't able to deal with the disaster. And now America is really in the unique position of they're seeing a surge in cases at the moment, but that is not a new wave. It's essentially still the first wave. They've never got control of the virus in any way, the way that other countries have, and brought their cases down to zero, only to see them resurge. This is still essentially the first wave of cases that is now coming up just ahead of the US election.
And so, Matt, this is our last chat to you ahead of election day. I've got to get your expectations. So there's all this discussion around the polls indicating that Biden's probably headed for victory, but the polls were notoriously wrong back in 2016. There are people saying there are the quite shy Trump voters who don't tell pollsters how they're going to vote or say they're going to vote another way. What is your expectation of what's going to happen on Wednesday, our time? And you've got to make a call. You can't sit on the fence.
Look, unless Donald Trump pulls out a bunch of rabbits out of his hat that nobody has seen so far, it seems unlikely that he's going to be able to win enough battleground states to hold on to the Electoral College on Wednesday, our time, when the election takes place. If it is a big blowout victory for Joe Biden, if he wins not just Pennsylvania but also Florida as well, then we may see a pretty quick resolution to this election. But if it is close and Joe Biden only wins some of the battleground states that he's winning in, it could get very, very messy very, very quick. Donald Trump is already promising to take it to the Supreme Court and promising bedlam in certain circumstances, depending on how the election goes, and claiming that it's going to try and be stolen out from under him afterwards. He says that he's going to declare victory on election night, even if he's only slightly ahead, despite there being many, many, many votes still to come in. So it's going to be messy one way or another, basically, Joe. But I think on the balance of probability at the moment, it looks like Joe Biden is going to win.